Hi everybody, so this is our second video of this VBA series, and we are going to talk about how we can do a referencing to a worksheet and also the cells inside this worksheet in this video. And second part of this, we are going to do a brief introduction to what is public and private sub, and also what is public and private function. Right, of course, this second part here, we will be introducing this thing in a very brief manner. So our main focus here is how we can actually referencing to different worksheets, and also how we can actually write a code in this VBA windows. Okay, we will start with a very simple example. Okay, so this is what we are trying to go through today or in this video, right? So worksheets and also sheet 1, they are representing two different ways of referring or referencing to the same worksheet. Okay, two different ways into one worksheet. You also have two different ways to refer to one cell in Excel, right? So one cell here means one small rectangle like this. So you can use cell, you can use range. So we will see what is the difference between these two and these two, right? Then after we have introduced this one, we will go into what is a public sub, private sub, right? So you have two types of a function, for example. So you can view this thing is like not to say function, but a process, right? So sub is like a series of action. Function is a series of action that gives you a value, you see. So you have sub and function, and each of these you have public and private. So we will look at what is public, private, what is sub and function, right? So this is what we are going to explore today. Okay, go into Excel file. This is a blank and new Excel file, right? So if I zoom it bigger so that we can see clearer. So what if we want to key in a number 1 2 3 4 5, like in this case, by using VBA? Of course, you can see this example is actually very simple, but our main objective is to learn how how we can differentiate worksheet and also sheet 1, two different ways, and also cell and range, right? So our main objective is to introduce this one, and of course we will also be using sub in this first example. Okay, right, so this example is this one. Let me delete this one. Okay, so one thing is that bear in mind, we will not be using not using loops, right? So if you have not using loop. So if you have learned any other programming language earlier, then you probably have learned about, like, for example, for I equal to 100, something like that, right? So for loop, and also do ... wow loop, right? So you have these two types of loop. Of course, over here we are not using loop because we will cover this thing in the future videos. So now in this video we focus on the basic coding. So now go to developer tabs. If you still remember, you can actually do a record macro here, which is what we have covered in the previous video. In this video we are going to write code. You can click view code here to bring up this VBA editor, or you use alternate F11, right? So if you still remember the keyboard shortcut, then alternate plus F11 is the keyboard to bring up VBA editor, right? So you have this one. Okay, and of course on the left hand side here, if you look at this window, you have project and also properties. So these are two windows that you can actually close it, and you can enable it back if you want. For example, under view, So you can go to the Project Explorer and also View, Properties windows. Okay, so under Project Explorer, basically these are the working trees, right? Book 1 is the Excel workbook that you have. If you start a new Control N, you can bring up open up a new Excel file. So go back to this VBA editor, right? So you will see book 2 over here now. So you have book 1, book 2. So you can see over here you have all these are add-ins. So Excel will list all the add-ins first, then first workbook, second workbook. Workbook refer to your Excel file, right? Okay, so under each workbook you have this Excel object. Okay, so let me close on book 2 first so that we can actually simplify the view here, right? So over here under this Excel work objects, you have worksheet and this workbook. This workbook refer to everything here, this whole workbook, right? So if you have 10 worksheet, then the workbook contains of 10 worksheet, and if you have this worksheet, it contains all the cells inside this worksheet, right? So these are like a collection of object, and if you double click at this sheet 1, okay, over here you are actually writing on code sheet 1. If you view it, look at this thing carefully. When the cursor is blinking here, that means you can type in anything, right? I mean, not anything, but you can start writing your VBA here. But over here, sheet 1 is in gray color, you see. So that is saying that you are actually writing under this part. Okay. So if you double click this one, then you start writing, you see it is under gray color, light gray color. Okay, so you can also minimize this one. Not minimize, make it smaller. Then you can choose your workbook, your editor accordingly, right? So this is to write it under sheet 1, this one. Okay, this one is under this workbook over here. But in this video, we are not going to write our code here nor here. We will have to insert a new module, right? So you can right click here, insert, and then go to module. User form and class module, we will cover that in futures. Over here we look at module first, and what we can do with this thing is that you can actually add more modules, right? But the problem with this thing is that when you add more modules, it is easier for you to group your codes together under, like all the codes that is doing the same thing, you can group them under one module. Second group of codes, then you group them under module 2. But if it is harder for you to recognize, then you can rename them. How to rename modules? You can go to this part under properties, right? So you have a name, module 1, then you can rename them here. For example, this is like for video 2, right? Second video. Then you see module 1, the name change to video 2. If you don't need this module 2, right click, you can actually remove it, right? Then you say no, I don't want to export it. Okay, those that you don't need, you can actually close it. You can close anything. The codes will be still there if you close here. So as long as you double click, you will be able to bring back this one. Okay, so that is the basic introduction about this editor. Okay, so once we have done with this editor, then we go back to Excel to try one more thing, right? So over here, the worksheet name, we rename it to, like, for example, testing, right? So once you have renamed this one, go back to the editor. You can see that over here you have sheet 1 bracket testing. So inside this bracket is actually the worksheet name. Sheet 1 here is the counter. That means if you add a new worksheet, you will have sheet 2 over here. Let's try one more time. So you click this one, you have sheet 2, right? So I'm not using. So I'm not going to use this worksheet, then I name it as not using, right? So NOT, not using. Then if you go back to here, you have sheet 1, sheet 2, testing, not using, right? So you see, sheet 1, sheet 2 are the counter. It's the worksheet ID. It's like your identity card. So you have the number 1, 2, 3 to represent this person. So sheet 1 is to represent this thing, right? Everything here. Sheet 2 is to represent this one, everything here. Okay. So now back to video 2 under modules. So if over here, most of the times we will be coding under modules. Of course, there are situations where we code under worksheet and also workbook. We will look at that in the future. So right now we can actually just imagine or just assume that most of the codes we will actually write them under modules. So if you want to start a simple codes, always right click, insert a module. It would be easier for you to learn this thing out and less hassle. Okay, so to start with a code, to start with your first code of this VBA, right? So if you go back to this one, we mentioned about sub and function. We start with sub first, right? So type in sub and then like example 1, right? So sub ex1 example 1. Over here, sub is actually representing subroutine. Okay, and what is subroutine? Subroutine actually you can view it like it's like actions. A lot of action or only one action doesn't really matter. Such as like for example, delete worksheet is one action, right? So what you can do in Excel, you right click delete the worksheet, so it is doing the same thing. Adding worksheet or open PDF also can, but we won't be covering this one inside this series of VBA. So this series of VBA we focus on Excel but not interacting with external program. Okay, then what is ex1? Ex1 is just the name of this subroutine, right? So apostrophe always represent commands. So commands won't be executed when you run this code. Okay, then you can start typing your code like AAA or BBB and something like that. But one good practice is that you always try to use one good practice is that always try to use the tab or indent, right? So we always try to like indent it to show that it is actually nested. Whatever you code here like AAA, BBB, they are nested or grouped under this sub, right? So easier for you to recognize, and you will feel that this one probably not so important because it is just a matter of like when you view it you feel nicer, right? So it is not necessity, but it is actually a very good practice so that when you review your code, right, or you want to modify it in the future, it will be easier to read. Also comments is very important, so always put in comments on what you are doing, right? Comments to make reading even easier. So this is also one mistake that I have actually made when I was starting my career, right? So when I start to code, then I always think that okay, I can code, I can actually solve the problems, right? So it doesn't really matter how I write the code, as long as my code is correct, the answer is correct, you get the project done, we get the job done, right? But problem with this kind of mindset is that if you are doing this project for one-off, no issue. But if eventually you have to like modify this one for another project, or in the future you want to just look at look back at what you have done, right? So it would be a nightmare when you are trying to do that. So when you are trying to read back your codes like 3 years later, then you will feel that I should have do it better last time, right? So that is exactly what I feel when I try to look at my codes when I first started my career, right? So it was like quite hard to read. So this kind of good practice is actually quite important, although it doesn't really help in the efficiency of the code, but it helps in the efficiency of modifying or reading or checking the codes, right? So now we start with the first line. Okay, so indent it, you use the tab to indent it, and then like if you want to write a code, so passing the value always from left to right, right? So we can do worksheet. So what is the worksheet name? We want to pass it over here under testing, right? So you can see under the object here. So testing, we want to pass into the range A1 equal to a value of 1, right? So if you read this code, you can see that worksheet testing, sorry, this one, right? Testing, and then A1. So I want to pass a value 1 here. I can also write this kind of codes in this way: worksheets testing dot CLS cells 1 2 1 equal to 2. So what is this thing? This is saying that I'm going to this worksheet, right, testing, which is this one, and then when you have up to here, you are referring to everything here, and we want to pass a value 2 into a specific cell, which is this one, right? So row number 2, column number 1. So row number 2, column number 1, and I want this value to be there. So that is how we can write worksheets with a cell, right? So you can also do something like this. So when you type in this one, when this is an object, right? So sheet 1 dot, you will see all the possible what is that called, option that you can have, like range, rows, and so on. So if you want range, you can use a tab, range A1 equal to, sorry, A3 equal to 3, right? So sheet 1 dot CLS also can, and then now you can see the description, row and column, right? So row 4, column 1 equal to 4, and then we need a last one, so just sheet 1 dot CLS 5 1 equal to 5, right? So with these 5 lines, 1 2 3 4 5, we can actually pass 5 values here. So you can actually try to run this code by using F5 while you are in VBA editor, right? So if you press F5 on your keyboard, then you will see the code being executed, and you should have 5 numbers here. Or you can click at this run here, right? So if you click this one, you see done already. So 1 2 3 4 5 is here, right? So one more time, you see, so they actually do the things exactly what we want, these 5 lines, right? So now the question is that what is the difference? This one, range and cell, what is the difference? Range, yes, cells, what is the difference? So one thing you can see is that range versus cell, the difference is that when you are using range, directly you get the address. That means what? That means easier for you to recognize, right? So this one, easier to, okay, let me just type it in the here, right? So when you talk about range versus cell, let me put my keyboard aside. Okay, cell, right. Range is easier to read. Cell, so what is the benefit of using cell, right? So you can see that cell is quite hard. When you are saying 2 1, then I have to say row 2 column number 1, which is this one. But using A1 or A2 directly, I know where it is. So that is the advantage of cell, range, right? But cell, you have one advantage when you are doing looping, right? So we will cover this one later, in later videos. When you are using looping, 1 2 can be running index, or sometimes when you are trying to refer to a place where the location is not unique or is not fixed. So probably you need to calculate a few values, then you know where is the row and column, then you have to use cell but not using range, right? So that is the difference here. Okay, then now over here we are looking at this one, right? So worksheet, testing, vs sheet 1. Okay, so sheet 1 here is actually referring to the ID here, right? So ID of that worksheet, and this one is referring to the name. So again, the difference here is that when you use worksheets, and also what is this, sheet 1, let's say. So when you are using worksheet, you are using the name, right? And this is using the ID. So what happens if you are using ID, for example, changing name is okay. You can change name. You can rename worksheet, right? So you can actually rename this one, and these lines are still working fine. That means if you are using sheet 1, the ID, you can rename your worksheet without having any issue. Over here, you cannot rename worksheet. If you rename worksheet, then from testing you change to let's say A, right? So these 3 lines will be still working fine, but not these 2, because there's no more worksheet testing. You see, we cannot find where is worksheet testing, so it doesn't work this way. So you have to just rename back, or you change the code to testing, right? So you have to change the code here if you rename the worksheet. Okay, so you can rename the worksheet. This is one thing that is the advantage. But of course, using worksheet name, it is easier to read. So personally, I will still prefer using the name instead of the ID, because easier for us to recognize when we are reading the codes, right? So worksheet testing, directly I know testing is here. I don't have to like sheet 1, then search sheet 1 is testing, then only I go back to this testing. Harder for us to review the code, right? So that is the difference of these 4 items here. Range, cell, versus also these worksheets and sheet 1, right? So using name and ID. So that is the difference here. One thing is that when you are using range, you can actually use more than one cell. For example, range A1 to A5, right? So you can do something like this, or C1. Okay, so you can actually do something like this, and then if you run the code, let me just insert more column first, delete everything. Okay, right. So if I change it to C1, then I run the code. You see, A1 to C1, they are all being passed a value of 1 inside here. So that is the idea of range. But if you are using cell, you can't do that. Okay, so I hope now up to this point we are clear with what is worksheets, range, cell, and also like using ID. This is how we can pass a value into this Excel file, right? So using code, using VBA, you pass a value into this Excel file. Okay, so we still keep to column A 1 to 5, right? So now what we want to do is that like for example the second sub, we try to read the value from this Excel and then do some calculation. For example, easier, I want to do, like for example, this one times 2, right? So I should be getting a value of 2, 4, 6, 8 and 10. So that is what we want here. We can also use VBA to do this thing. So for example, you can start with sub example 2, right? So again, indent it. So you can actually copy this one. Let me copy this one so that I don't have to type so many things, right? So now I'm going to change from all column A to column B, right? So something like this. So column 2, B is column 2, right? So if I run this code, now what happened? So I will have this exactly because I shifted from column A to B, right? So instead of typing 2, 4, 6, what I want is I want to read the value here times 2. So I can actually read the value here. Okay, so this one is when you have like incomplete lines. Let me just copy first. So red color represents some warning or error. Okay, so you see over here this line I'm saying that B1 should be equal to A1 times 2. You can just do the multiplication directly like this. Okay, so let me remove all these comments. Okay, right, so the rest is just a copy, right? So I mean I'm repeating the first line. So again, bear in mind I'm not using the, what is that called, the looping yet. Okay, so I will keep looping in the future videos, right? So that's why we have to do this thing manually, one by one, but of course we don't have to do that. Okay, so you can actually mix them together. Like if you are using worksheet, over here you still can use like sheet 1, no issue, right? So you not necessarily you have to follow the same way, but of course when you are trying to write a code, always be consistent. It's easier for you to check your codes in the future. Okay, so when you run this one, you see when you click run, you have 2 sub, right? Excel won't run both together. Excel will only run the one that you have the cursor blinking here, you see. So if I click here, means I'm running this one. If I click here, means I'm running this one only. Okay, so now let me delete everything here. So sorry, this is not column 2 but column 1, right? So this is also column 1. Okay, so let's say if you see I click here, my cursor is here, I click the run or I use F5, go to here, I get all the 0 because I'm taking blank cell times 2. So blank, when you do a multiplication, blank becomes 0. 0 times 2 is 0. So the same ideas repeats here. So you get all the 0. But if I run this first, so you see cursor is here, right? So inside this first sub, then I run F5 or click here, go back, I get 1 to 5. This one won't be updated automatically because this is not formula link. Okay, but if I run this code now, then this thing will be updated. Okay, so this is the basic idea on how we can read and write values, or it is either value or a text into this VBA, using VBA into Excel, right? So sub ex3, right? So now this example we see how we write a string. So exactly the same thing. Let's say if we use this one, right? So row number 6, we want to just name it like sub1. Okay, then you can copy this whole thing, paste here. We call this as sub2 in column B, right? So what this example 3 does is that we expect sub1 here, sub2 here, right? So if you click run, then you see you will have these two texts here. So writing a text or a string, you use this symbol, right? So it should be quite standard. So without this one, Excel will treat it as a name or as a variable. Okay, so that is how we have this basic one. Okay, now we move to the next part where we are talking about sub versus function and public versus private. So you can have like public sub, private sub, right? And also public function, private function. So when we write these 3 example, right? So we start with sub. Sub is actually the same as public sub. So same idea, function is the same as public function. Okay, so whenever you don't specify it is public or private, by default it will become public. Okay, so public sub and private sub. Now we look at what if we have private, right? So private and public, the difference is that public, you can call it anywhere. You call it from anywhere. But private, you can only call it from the same space. Okay, so this definition is the same for both sub and also function. Okay, so let's just try this thing a little bit. We insert one more module, right? So this is called module 1. Video 2 is where you have the codes, right? So if you write a sub here again when you start with sub, this is a public sub, right? So we call it as calling. I call what? I want to call ex1, right? So I mean I'm calling the first example, right? So I want to call this code. So then call ex2, then call ex3, right? So what we have here is that just now to achieve all these 12 cells, we separated these codes into 3 sub, right? So which are all these 3 subs here, ex1, ex2, ex3. So these 3 subs does everything here, but we have to run 3 times, right? So run here one time, and one time. So to make things simpler, then you can actually create a sub that is calling all of them, right? So no issue. If let's say now you run this thing, Excel will run all these together, I mean one by one, line by line, so you will get all these things, right? So you don't have to like run 3 times, but now you run one time, and inside this one time they will call this thing one. After this thing done, then move to the next one, and so on. So you see, calling these 3 codes from module 1, it is not under the same module, no issue, because we are using sub. But if we change all the sub to private sub, right, so we see what happened. Okay, so changing this to private sub, and then if you call it again, let me just, okay, sub or function are not defined, you see. So what it means here is that they cannot find ex1 already. Just now this thing no issue, but now you get this error, right? So what it means here is that you can't find, Excel cannot find ex1. So this cannot find is due to private, right? Because you are calling it from different space, right? So it should be under this module or this private sub. You cannot call it outside this module. Same thing if you have the sub or the function written under worksheet 1 or under workbook, you cannot call them outside this worksheet if let's say you define them using a private, right? So that is the difference here. So that means you can see when you use public sub or when you use sub itself, it is like safer. So no, you won't have this kind of issue. But of course, what is why we need private sub is that when you want to contain this function only inside this module, that means sometimes you might have the same name, but different function. So I can define ex2 under this module. I can also define another ex2 inside this module. So if you want to use the same name but actually they are doing this separately, then you can actually use a private sub and do it under different module. Okay, so that is the idea here. Okay, so we know that this is not working, and yellow color is representing this is in debug mode, right? So if you run one more time, you see this is the debug mode. You cannot continue running even though you move your code to another place until you clear this one. To clear this one, you can actually just reset it. That is the easiest way. But the yellow color here representing Excel suspecting this line causing issue. Of course, this line is causing issue, right? Because this line you are calling, I mean the name can be anything, right? So you are calling this private sub from another module, right? So this thing is issue. Of course, if you change this one back to public, then no issue. For example, whether it is public or without the sub, then they are actually the same. Okay, reset it and you run one more time. You see, it is still this one, not this line that causing issue, because all the codes here no issue, right? The issue is that you are calling it from an incorrect location. So you should not call it here. So if you put it public and then you put it let's say by sub itself only, right? So these two are actually still referring to public sub, right? So we run one more time. You see this line cannot run, but the issue is over here. So that is the debugging. You need to be familiar with this debugging if you are using VBA quite a lot. Okay, so what can we do? We can actually copy this one. I mean, you move the code over here, right? So if I move my code here, then you see one more time. If I run this one, okay, clear. You see, done already. So I'm running this code. Let me delete one more time and show you one more time. Right, you see now no issue. I click run, no issue. This thing is here. So reason for this thing is that these two are public sub, so no issue. You can call it from anywhere inside this workbook, no issue. The third one is private sub, right? So you can only call them under the same space. That means same module. You cannot call it under different object or different space. You want to call from module 1, you want to call this ex3, sorry, that is not possible. Okay, so that is the difference between private and public, and in this case we talk about private sub and public sub. Okay, so that is a sub or subroutine. Now we look at you can actually insert to make things slightly less messy. I insert another one. So module 2 here, I just rename it as like custom function. Never mind, call it FUNC. functions. Okay, so once you have this function module created, we can actually start defining our function. In fact, you can define your functions under other modules also. Right, so we start with the public function first. So a public function, you can start it from function, and then like giving a name. So for example, calculation, right? So no, multiply. Okay, and then this function multiply takes two values, for example, so x as integer, y as integer as well. And then what types of what is the variable types that you want to return? I want to return it as integer also, right? Okay, so now I can say that define result as integer. Okay, so bear in mind here, this line dim result, whether you do it or not doesn't really matter, right? Whether you declare variable or not in VBA is optional. Declare is optional, but good to have. Of course, you have many reasons why we need to have this thing. I won't go into technical parts, but I'm giving you a very practical part. So when you talk about technical parts, you should go into like the numerical methods and also scientific computings. Then you should know why we want this thing to be precise, so that you can avoid the rounding issue, right? So that is one reason. Okay, now why it is good to have is that this is my own practice. For example, when I define the variables, I always start with capital letter, right? So when I type the codes, I always avoid all the capital letters. So when I type in something like this, you see the formatting, everything is quite off. But when I press enter, space will be automatically added in, and R will be capitalized. So that is the idea here, because I immediately I know whether I have a typo or not over here, right? So if I have typo, I won't have like for example something like this. So you see the R won't be capitalized. So that is the advantage, one small advantage of this thing, so that I can avoid the typo when you have a very complicated and large codings, right? So a project, it is very hard for you to check the typo. If let's say you have written 20,000 lines of codes, and then you run it and you realize that something is not right. Of course, it's quite easy to recognize sometimes, but sometimes it could be quite hard. So that's why I have this practice, so that I always press enter, I know whether there is a typo in variable or not. Okay, so once you have this one, then you just pass back the value multiply as the value of result. Okay, so once you have defined this function this way, right, so you can actually do like multiply, okay, 5 and 6, you get a value of 30, right? So you see, you can actually call the function over here from Excel, from this function module. So you are actually calling this function outside the module. That's why you need a public function. If let's say we create something similar but start with private function, so we see what happened. Private function, addition, and then xy. Okay, so if you don't want to define the variable, you can also do something quite fast. Addition equal to x plus y. Okay, so over here, you see you cannot have this addition function over here. The same thing if let's say we just directly change this one to private, then of course whatever have done, they won't reverse back until you press enter again. Okay, so this is multiply equal to multiply. So you see no more multiply function over here. You cannot do that anymore, right? So no more. So but just now when you change it to public, then you can see that you will have this multiply right over here. So that is public and private. So what happens if let's say you are using private? That means you define the private function here. You can only call it within this what is that called, module, right? So I can create another public function. Let's say function testing, right? XY. So my testing is equal to addition. So I'm calling this function addition from here to here, right? And passing the same XY into it. Okay, right. So now I can have this testing function, and 5 3 is 8, right? You see, so I get an 8. So you can declare the variable like this. You can omit all the declaration also, but in this case sometimes not very useful. You may have all the technical issue, but of course easier for you to write the code, so it is actually personal preference. But I think I would still recommend to always declare the variable before you actually write the codes. Okay, so if you want to see what is the difference, then we do something like this. Okay, you see now you get a 10, testing 5 3. That means you pass 5 and 3 into here, right? So 5 3 you pass into this function, and this function is doing 5 plus 3 is 8. So this one equal to value of 8 plus 2. So 8 plus 2, right? So that is what we have, and is equal to 10. All right, so that is public and private function. So in this video we cover worksheet and also sheet 1, range and also cell, right? Like this. What are the difference? And also we cover public private sub, public private function. Okay, so in next video we will be looking at what is worksheet versus sheets, and also chart versus charts. So again these are the basic. Then once we have all these basic, we will start going into the codes, or how we write codes, how we simplify it and make it more efficient. These are for future, and today we are going to end here. Thanks for watching, and then I will see you in the next video. Okay, see you, bye.